Uh, we'll now have the questions, comments, discussions. Would you like to collect a few questions and
It
then?
doesn't matter.
Okay, maybe we'll follow.
Yes.
Take them in bunches of 3. Professor Mitra, Rajiv, and then. Okay, Professor Mitra.
Professor Jain, thank you very much for your fluent presentation of a fascinating theme. A little bit self-congratulatory we can be in this institute because we have been pioneering in terms of recognizing this unknown quantity called subnational actors in the international arena. We have spotted Gujarat when Gujarat was not recognized by anybody else because of Godra, and now Andhra Pradesh.
Okay.
The paper remarkably responds to the 2 criteria I have for questions that we ask at this institute. Every question we ask here must have a practical significance. As I said quite brutally, what is in it for Singapore? And the second question is, what is in it for science or for studies? Because you have shown us that the world has moved beyond Westphalia, where the whole world consisted only of tight boxes called nation states, complete with sovereignty, and beyond them there was nothing. The other one is the global arena, where you get into internet, buy things at eBay, and you believe that the world consists of actors who are individuals and corporations. What you are showing is that between the nation state and the individual, there is yet another level, and that's the one that really matters. If Singapore wants to do business in Andhra Pradesh or in Kashmir, Singapore must ask, can Andhra Pradesh actually respect a contract? Where does the buck lie at the end of the day? That's the practical significance of your paper, and you have talked about it eloquently, so I'll not dwell on it further. My question would be on the theoretical significance of this paper. Now, you're talking about emergence. Is it measurable? You imply it is, because you say that some states have emerged, others are emerging, and the rest are stagnating or are not even aware of the importance of emergence, like my own state, Odisha. So if we think of emergence as a dependent variable of your analysis, what are the explanatory variables? Once again, we have got quite a few of them. Some are theorized, others are not yet theorized. One of the areas which is not theorized at all is the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution is a Westphalian constitution, which believes everything is done from Delhi, that Kashmir's fate can be settled without consulting Kashmiris, or for that matter, the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh is a matter between Delhi and Dhaka, and West Bengal doesn't appear at all. Why is that the case? It's because the Constitution says categorically in the federal division of powers, some things can be done only by the center, some things can be done by the states, something can be done by both, and things which have not been mentioned at all belong exclusively to the center. What you are showing is that the world has moved beyond 1947, that there is probably a case to solve the anomaly between authority and power. Authority lies in Delhi, power lies in Chennai and Kolkata. So what is the way forward? Should there be a constitutional commission to sort out this particular anomaly? Because until we have sorted it out, the practical significance of the theoretical issue will remain unsettled. So can we go beyond anecdotal descriptions to a theoretical analysis in terms of quantification? And if we do that, how can we transform the theoretical significance into practical issues like signing of contracts? Or how do chief ministers derive the incentive to go here and there? Of course, one can go on a junket with the whole family. Or one can be like Chandrababu Naidu, a chief executive officer of the state, traveling at the expense of the state, not of Delhi, and accountable to the state legislature. Thank you.
Rajiv?
Thank you. A few comments to make. First, about the title of your topic, Indian States Emergence in International Arena. Actually, it's more federalization of foreign policy which is happening. That's what I understood you are indicating to. And it is limited only to economic foreign policy, not other matters. In Indian political system, foreign policy is completely part of a union list, and on mainly on security matters, the state governments cannot do any agreement with any foreign countries. Even travel of bureaucrats who are posted in state governments, even for their private visit, they need approval from the government. So it's entirely centralized. I missed the initial 5 minutes of your talk. You were mentioning Rajni Kothari's politics in India. When we talk about politics in India, you rightly pointed out that it was highly centralized, ruled by Congress government. But when the emergence of regional parties started, and till date, foreign policy is impact in the domestic politics is very minimum. It's not in the election agenda at all. National parties make some remarks in passing, but that doesn't decide the electoral politics. That is one major reason state governments are not very active in foreign policy. But when it comes to economic policies, they raise their concerns. They are actively engaged through business chambers. You also highlighted the visits of foreign dignitaries in recent periods in different state governments, and also some state chief minister visiting foreign countries. That is not entirely decided by a state government. Certain foreign government have some, or funding agencies have their program where they have programs to engage chief ministers of Indian states, which is based on the inputs provided by their embassies or think tanks, that these are potential states where our investors can invest. And then they have set up a fund where they, for example, Japan, your area of research, there is a foundation which has set up a fund to engage chief minister, and they tried to engage UP chief minister. Twice meeting was cancelled when I was there. I don't know if it happened. But it was identified by Japanese government. They engaged, they gave that outsourced to business chambers, and they do it the activity. That is one. Other mechanism is that Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent their queries and questions through business chambers to different state governments and seek their inputs on various policy issues, which is mostly on investment and economic matters completely. You also referred to one report, state competitiveness. FICCI has also done a similar study where they have surveyed, I think, 20 plus states, and they have I don't know if report is published or in public domain, but that was studied, and also they presented it to different ministries. So the study is there, and that is done on regular basis by business chamber, SOCHAM, CII, and FICCI. So that's how they are. So when you talked about bottom-up approach of foreign policy and lack of institutionalization as part of challenge or lack of policy focus, there is institutional deficit at central level. Bureaucracy was mainly responsible to implement policies because politicians has least concern about foreign policy to win an election. But now some issues are being debated, and at least they are, as you gave right in Mamata Banerjee's or Tamil Nadu's options, that how they obstructed because of local regional political issues. But state governments do not need any institution to pursue foreign policy, like the example of Quebec you gave. Quebec has intentions to get away from Canada. They want separation from Canada. That's not the case in all states in India. So that will not be applicable in India. They have their French language. So when you go to Canada, it's mandatory to use both the languages, French and English, which is not the case in India. So Indian case is different. And studying state involvement in federal structure, how they are providing their inputs, I suggest you must take into account how businesses are engaging state government through them and channelizing their inputs to the Ministry of External Affairs and vice versa. Thank you.
So, Ronojoy, okay. Yeah.
Just to add to something that Professor Mitra raised about the situation with the Constitution, where we also know that foreign treaties are not don't have to be ratified in Parliament, which was one of the issues that came up during the 2008 nuclear deal that was signed, that India signed with the United States. But for the for the land boundary agreement that you mentioned, because that required a constitutional amendment, that actually allowed the regional parties a say, and it kind of ties in with your the idea of coalition politics, the last decade or 2 decades or so, and that in fact allowed in both, not just the northeastern states but also West Bengal and the Trinamool Congress to have a say, and they had to be brought on board before. Although this land boundary agreement was passed, as you mentioned, unanimously, all parties in fact backed it. So I think there are certain areas where which does require, say, as in the case of border related issues, which does require a constitutional amendment, then that does allow parties to have a say. Whereas there are a whole host of other agreements like the nuclear agreement where really state governments or regional parties don't have a say. So one might make a distinction between issues where they can or cannot have a say.
Purnendra, would you like to respond to these
I
for the time being?
Yes.
We can have another round of...
The constitutional aspect is a very important issue, I think. And I didn't go into details of that. But as you mentioned about the Constitution, very clearly, there is a union list, there is a state list, there is a concurrent list. And anything which is not mentioned naturally belongs to the national government. So in a sense, the central government's dominance in policy matters is clearly reflected in the Constitution. But the point here I'm trying to make, maybe I didn't explain, is that these state governments are trying to find a space within these kinds of constitutional constraints which they have got. Because if you look at examples from unitary states in China, maybe you will say, well, China is a different case, being an authoritarian state. Let's take the example of Japan, for example, which is a unitary state. And the local governments in Japan do not have constitutional power. Nothing has been said in the Constitution what kinds of powers local governments have got. And yet they found space for themselves to relate to the international community, sometimes challenging the national government, right? So each each subnational government have these kinds of constraints. It could be legal, it could be administrative, it could be other kinds of constraints, constitutional, which you have rightly said in terms of how you theorize in terms of constitutional thing, which is quite interesting. But what I realize, and I may be wrong, that state governments in India at the moment are not trying to challenge any constitutional constraints on them. What they're trying to do, where they can find some space within those constraints, where they can have some area where they can do things which will serve their local interests. So that's one point I wanted to make. In terms of policy relevance, this particular area is, I think, it's very policy relevant, right? And as you said, the question is whether Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu or any other state government, do they have the legal authority to sign an agreement and then implement that, right? I don't know the legality of this, but I'm sure there are areas in terms of investment, in terms of trade, where they can work within the global and national parameters and do these kinds of activities. And once they know exactly what they can do, and if they sign an agreement, they should be able to implement that agreement. I don't see why there will be a problem if they are not stepping on the toes of the central government. The central government would be only too happy if more investment comes. Doesn't matter which state it comes. It will show in overall Indian statistics as well that the investment in India. So in a sense, these state governments can and are working on behalf of the national government to enhance national interests through their own local interests. So they are not kind of obstructing, or they are not creating a situation whereby the national government might feel uncomfortable. So as long as they are not doing those kinds of things, the national government, in my view, would be too happy for the state governments to do these kinds of things. And you rightly mentioned about Westphalian system, how that is kind of has come under attack, although it has not it hasn't gone out of the theoretical consideration, and that's not going to go out of the theoretical consideration. In international relations, we know, Malcolm will agree, realists still have got very strong analytical framework and ideas that how states work. But within that realist framework, we are seeing movement here and there. And, there has been theorization about how national governments are becoming, the borders are becoming porous on the one hand. The other thing, sovereignty has become porous as well. Is if you look at the whole EU, for example, where you've got a supranational entity, how subnational governments have been actively kind of connecting to each other. And I haven't quite talked about subnational governments connecting to each other. For example, when Modi was in Kyoto, he chose Varanasi as a city where Kyoto and Varanasi could be kind of sister cities, and how Varanasi could learn from Kyoto. And I guess there will be many more examples like that. To what extent, now the question will arise, to what extent Varanasi as a city have the ability and wherewithal and other things to learn from Kyoto, right? So we have to question those kinds of things, and we can keep questioning, but the point which I'm trying to make here is what I'm trying to say here is that new things are happening in India. It never happened before. But there are many theoretical, conceptual, policy-relevant questions which we need to keep asking, and as a matter of fact, do further research on this, right? So it's a kind of fertile ground for researchers to think about this. And I may not have thought it that hard and deep at this stage, but I want to bring this to everyone's attention, that there is this fertile ground where people need to think and do things. Just very quickly, I agree with most of what you have said about states, governments, economic, foreign policy, and I'm not aware how the central government can direct through business chambers and what state government should do. I'm not quite certain, and I don't know about that, but it could be quite interesting if something like that happened.
I want to add that there is an institutional mechanism between FICCI and MEA. Every quarter, certain business leaders, select business office bearers, meet with the foreign secretary and some officials of different divisions
Okay.
of Ministry of External Affairs to discuss important business issues and what are their issues in respective regions or countries.
Okay.
And ministry also put back their demands that on these issues they want inputs from businesses.
Okay, I'm sure that's happening. But I'm sure that was happening in the past as well. But the highlight or things which we can highlight that these state leaders are now becoming proactive agents of these kinds of activities. In the past they were not. So business communities might be doing something, but if the state leadership are at the political level, if they are uninterested, it will be very difficult for them to move forward, right? Now, because there is some kind of interest in business as well as political leadership level, all these commercial, economic activities can accelerate, in my view. Yeah, go ahead.
But it is also with the liberalization of policies at the central level, that central government is opening and giving more room for a state government to engage and attract investment.
Yeah, sure.
So, and you also mentioned different legal and other issues, administrative issues. It's also with
Yeah. No, thanks very much. The last one about, you just added to what the director had to say. And I realized that, international agreements in India, they do not need parliamentary approval, right? Whereas in countries like Australia, for example, I think parliament, even in Japan, I think parliament is.
I think the clarification is, as Ronojoy mentioned, they do not require parliamentary approval till there is no amendment of the constitution involved.
Correct. Yes.
But the India-Bangladesh land boundary agreement
Yes.
had to go to the parliament
Yes.
because it required an amendment of the constitution.
Yes.
Otherwise, it would not have.
It's mainly in the case of territorial issues where territory needs to be exchanged with foreign countries, then constitutional amendment.
A legislation like the goods and services tax, for example, requires an amendment of the constitution. That's why it's stuck in the logjam.
Yeah.
But there are other legislations that do not require such amendments.
Yeah. Interesting.
Malcolm.
Thanks, Purnendra. This is a question or maybe another way of looking at it, so a future paper, and I'm wondering, is there a growing demand from other states to have greater interaction with other national states, greater interaction with Indian states, particularly because land rights issues that are often at the state level are a huge barrier to foreign direct investment in many cases, including Andhra Pradesh. And also many states, now that they think India is more important, are starting to open up consulates outside of Delhi. So I'm wondering, in your research, whether you came across any of that kind of outside-in push to engage more with Indian states in the international arena. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Jain. Usually, I see that the CMs visiting overseas with the blessing of central government, it's a pro-government, central government CMs, not the one that sits in the opposition or opposition governments. And a very, very difficult case here is the Delhi politics CM and the central. You see, they can't even get their act together. And sometimes we wonder, is Delhi a state or just a mayor? See, and somebody wanted, even he told me, no, it's just a mayor. That's one point. The other point from state to state, or thing that some business people have learned from them is that once the GST, if it ever comes in a year or two, the cross-border taxing that takes place now, that's going to be a hefty problem there. You see, because the GST is put in place, and then how one border to another state, will they be collecting the taxes? So that's going to be a big problem for foreign investors. And they're already looking at it. How are they going to manage that? So these are 2 points of question. Great, thank you.
Any other
yeah.
questions? Maybe we can. Please.
Thank you. Maybe just chip in here. I've been to Gujarat when Prime Minister Modi was the Chief Minister. So my question is actually, is there any kind of carryover effect now that he's Prime Minister of India? Would Gujarat get certain favors because he's Chief Minister? And as a contrast, you mentioned Tamil Nadu just now. Tamil Nadu, I'm not very sure about this, but Tamil Nadu is not from Congress, right? The government.
No.
It's not under Congress. It's
No.
It's nobody, yes. So how does that feature? When Congress was in power, they were already quite independently moving. So in today's context of Prime Minister Modi, how does Tamil Nadu actually feature in this kind of issues too? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abedin. Purnendra, I'll add a final query of mine to the, and then you can clear this off in the 3.5 minutes time that you might have. I was wondering whether in this entire discourse that you are, building, whether you have sort of kind of looked at the role that the diaspora might be having in this, because I think if we look at states like Andhra and Gujarat, it's kind of quite obvious that the push might be coming from the other side, because I remember distinctly that in 2000 when Mr. Clinton went to Hyderabad, Mr. Naidu presented him with a driving license. And at that time, Mr. Naidu and Hyderabad had just come out with this scheme where you could do a driving license on a biometric basis, a technology which at that time was not available in the US. And this was specifically the reason for which he went to Hyderabad to take a look. And this was backed up by Andhra Telugu techies in the Silicon Valley, who brought it to the notice of Mr. Clinton that you must go to Hyderabad and see what is going on there in the biometrics. Gujarat, Pravasi Bhartiya and the rest of it, heavily diaspora driven. In fact, now UP is beginning to have its first Pravasi Bhartiya Divas. And that's obvious because the UP migration has become large enough. So has from Rajasthan. So I was wondering whether in this whole discourse, you might want to connect this to the diaspora.
Okay, let me take yours and then go backwards kind of thing. You are absolutely right. Actually, I had on my slide, and I also wanted to respond to your question about business, that the diasporic community, Indian diaspora, has been also a catalyst in this. And you're absolutely right why Bill Clinton went to Andhra at that time. To a certain extent, why Modi went to Karnataka at that time. So these communities, they work as kind of lobby groups, right? In US or in other countries, but in particular in the US. Absolutely no doubt about it. But the point is that unless these chief ministers and states are receptive to these kinds of lobbying and pressure, that's not going to happen. No matter what amount of diasporic pressure is there, if these state chief ministers are not responding to these kinds of calls, this will not happen. And it happened because you have got chief ministers who are they want to actively promote themselves, their state, engage internationally, and then there comes an opportunity and they grab that opportunity with both hands. Without Modi, I don't know what Gujarat would have looked like in terms of its internationalization or international engagement. I don't know. It's very difficult to know. But what we know that yes, Modi made great efforts in terms of going to Japan, to going to China, to Singapore he came. So as chief minister, these guys traveling overseas, promoting their states, were something completely new. So they have taken these kind of leadership, Absolutely no doubt about it. And diaspora played a role, but I wouldn't say that that was because of diaspora that these things happen. But this is certainly a factor, a variable in that. Now, coming to the question about Delhi, I don't know, this is quite a bit difficult. You know, Delhi is not a state in the real, you know, constitutional sense, right? It has got a semi-state, right? It's a union territory, but it's not union territory like Chandigarh, which doesn't have a chief minister. So it has, the chief minister, like the police, for example, is controlled by the Home Ministry, not by Delhi state, whereas all the states.
It is a legislature.
It's a legislative. So it's a very anomalous situation for Delhi. And, you know, this is, I'm sure things will be discussed here about the chief minister and relationship. Maybe this is not the forum to discuss that particular aspect. It's quite complicated at the moment. But to the Malcolm's question about whether you know, other countries or nations around the world are taking note of what is happening at state level. It seems to me, yes, in a limited way. Otherwise, you know, give an example of Bill Clinton or Modi and others visiting these states. And now more specifically, if you look at if the new bullet train project, for example, in the case of Japan, if it goes, which has been signed actually, between Mumbai and Gujarat, right? And we know Maharashtra is like, it's a BJP, Gujarat is BJP. So, but the Japanese government has to negotiate the state governments, right? They just cannot depend upon the Modi government in the center to have this project going in a smooth fashion, because there are land issues which they belong to the state government. There will be other kinds of labor issues, state governments, water, for example, state all those kinds of things, they come under state list. So these, the Japanese government and the contractor appointed on behalf of the Japanese government has to negotiate Maharashtra and Gujarat in that context. And there have been examples, actually new consulates are being opened in regional towns in India. I think the Australian government has got two new consulates yeah, UK is doing that. I mean, on the one hand, you will see some governments are kind of reducing their consulates, like in Japan, Australia has reduced, but in India, and this is quite typical. If the economy, there is an economy, you know, growing economy state, you know, eyes are focused there, and India is that example. So I think there will be more and more interest. And one of the ideas, and the director said that our job is also to make these things policy relevant, because if I can publish this paper and, you know, people will read and think about, you know, what's happening in Indian states. So our job is also kind of public education, if you like, and hopefully if this paper is published, I'm sure if not in this journal, somewhere else, it will get published, you know, get published. So that's the kind of role we see as well, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Gurdeep Singh's question regarding the GST.
Yeah.
What are your opinions on this nonsense that's going on? When will it be?
I really don't know. Frankly, I haven't studied this area, but what I hear is that this year is like something will happen. You know, this. I don't know. I haven't studied, so I should not pretend that I know. Oh yes, sorry about that. The point is now with a government in Sri Lanka, which is kind of has got friendly relationship with India, right? So I think the role of Tamil Nadu will weaken to a certain extent with the new government in Sri Lanka, which is very receptive to the ideas that there are issues in Sri Lanka. And to a certain extent, one could say that the race or the ethnic question in Sri Lanka, in my view, I may be again wrong, is not that salient at the moment. Seems that things have settled for a while. So I don't think the Tamil Nadu government is pressing the Modi government on that issue.
Mine is more than Sri Lanka. When you talk about diaspora,
Yeah.
is there a difference between Tamil-speaking diaspora and non-Tamil-speaking diaspora? So when you talk about Tamil Nadu and Modi coming to Singapore, do they match in terms of the diaspora angle?
It's an interesting question because it should, because if you look at, I mean, Singapore is a kind of a different example where you have got a very a particular Indian ethnic group which dominates. But if you look at the examples in the US or in UK or Australia, where you have got a kind of mixed ethnic groups, Indian, groups, linguistics and regional groups, one could say that, well, of course, there are a lot more Gujaratis who went to Modi's, speeches and open forums than others. But there were others who were involved there. It's not just one particular community which went to listen to Modi. There might be dominance of that particular community, but others go, and it seems to me that Modi is now increasingly, more, accepted as a national leader than just being a leader of Gujarat. So that transformation I could see in Australia through talking to people. I mean, it's not just the Gujaratis in Australia who talk up about Modi, but there are others who talk very positively about Modi. So I don't know exactly the Singaporean situation. Maybe I'm not the right person to comment on that particular issue. Yeah. Singapore profile is changing too as well, of course. If you look at here in this room itself, there's a bit of reflection there. Yeah.
Thank you, Purnendra. I think thanks very much to you because we have begun the year on an intellectually stimulating note. Thanks to this excellent lecture. This is a gift from us to you, a book written by our colleague Sindapal Singh.
Okay.
India in South Asia and the investigation of domestic identity politics and the foreign policy from Nehru to the BJP. So,
wonderful. Well, thank you
a gift
very
for
much.
you. And as you know, Routledge publications are expensive. So we end up giving you an expensive gift.
Thank you very much.
And to continue the conversation over tea and coffee outside.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Again, thank you very much for this opportunity to share my idea.
Thank you. I'm constantly on the lookout for